Good night. Tonight we'll spend some time together, lying side by side with the past. Our story is set in a time when desire itself was dangerous. But not for the ones who felt it. For the ones who provoked it, by existing. A girl could be punished for how she walked. A woman could be shamed for the curve of her smile. And a widow could lose everything because a man claimed she made him think unholy thoughts. In the world we're stepping into tonight, temptation wasn't something women acted on. It was something they were. We'll trace how women's beauty became a liability, how their voices were twisted into seduction, and how, whether they were bold or quiet, clothed or veiled, young or aging, their bodies were still treated as proof of guilt. From the pulpit to the village square, from the monastery door to the bedroom hearth. We'll look at the long, miserable ways women were blamed for men's desires, and how often they were the only ones punished for it. So if you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. England, around the year 1320. In this opening part of our story, we'll explore how medieval women's beauty, real or perceived, could be turned against them. This wasn't about what they did. It was about how others looked at them, and how the blame always landed in their laps. She didn't have to say a word. In some places, she didn't even need to move. Just standing there, perhaps too still, too visible, too present, could be enough. A glimpse of ankle, a curve beneath the bodice, a flush on the cheeks from carrying a heavy bucket. That was all it took. A man's eyes might linger for a moment too long, and the whole village would know who tempted him. It wasn't her desire that drew suspicion. It was his. But that wasn't how the story would be told. The official story, the one passed along in hushed tones over wash basins, murmured by friars in morning sermons, or carved into the margins of confessional records, was that she invited the attention. That she turned her face just so, knowing full well what it meant. That she walked past the baker's door with a sway that couldn't possibly be accidental. They had words for women like that. Temptrix. Jezebel. Siren. Witch. None of them were written in the local dialect, of course. Latin had a way of making the insult feel holy. There was no male equivalent for any of these. Now, to be fair, not every gaze would ruin a woman's life. Most of the time, it just made her uncomfortable. Maybe she was 15. Maybe she was 40. Maybe she just buried a child and wasn't thinking about much at all except how to boil the linen clean again. But the look came anyway. And the judgment followed it. Because in a world where women's modesty was considered the gatekeeper of men's virtue, one man's wandering eye was always someone else's fault. And it was rarely his. You might think it was only the poor girls who got blamed like this, the milkmaids and scullery workers, the ones with no title to protect them. But no. Nobility helped, but it didn't shield. A nobleman's wife could be accused just as quickly as a peasant's daughter, especially if she had the misfortune of being both beautiful and bored. In fact, her station might only make things worse. Because when someone powerful said he'd been led astray by a woman's eyes, her station became the spectacle. It gave everyone more to talk about. There are letters from the 14th century that describe women being forbidden from looking directly at men in church, especially priests. Not because it was impolite, but because the mere act of meeting a man's eyes could be construed as invitation. And once a man felt invited, well, you know how the logic goes. She must have meant it. She must have wanted something. She must have tempted him. And if he lost his place in the sermon, if he stumbled over the Psalms, it wasn't a lapse in his holiness. It was her hair, her lips, her smile, or her very presence, breathing quietly in the third pew on the left. So when a man stared too long, people whispered about the woman. When a scandal bloomed, the petals fell on her shoulders. And when punishment came, it was her reputation that withered. This part of our story explores how modesty became more than a virtue. It became a social defense system. One that women were expected to build, wear, perform, and police, often against each other. Because once beauty was considered dangerous, modesty became the antidote. But not the helpful kind of antidote. Not the sort that neutralizes the poison and gives you your life back. No, this was the kind that required permanent vigilance, daily discomfort, and community enforcement. It started with fabric. The right fabric could hide you. The wrong one could get you fined. Or shamed. Or followed home from the market by a man convinced that your neckline was a coded invitation. Necks, ankles, wrists, even fingers, all had to be carefully managed. A woman with a fitted kirtle might be seen as too bold. A girl with a belt too high on the waist might be accused of trying to highlight her hips. Even hair became dangerous once it left the confines of a coif. Loose hair? That was reserved for two categories of women, brides, and women of ill repute. Of course, context mattered. Unless it didn't. If you were married, you were supposed to cover your head, unless you were in mourning, or nursing, or possibly in court. But then again, if the wrong person saw you uncovered at the wrong moment, the exceptions didn't matter. There were sumptuary laws, too, actual written laws, that regulated who could wear what. These rules were meant to preserve class boundaries, but they also reinforced moral ones. Rich women could wear silk, but not red silk. Poor women could wear wool, but not dyed wool. Because bright colors, apparently, were a gateway sin. It's a bit like how wearing leggings today somehow turns into a moral debate, except instead of being passive-aggressively judged in the school pickup line, you might be publicly fined by your local bailiff. And then there were the eyes. Not men's eyes this time, but women's eyes. Because in most towns, the church didn't need to monitor every woman's wardrobe or posture or tone of voice. Other women would do it for them. Mothers trained their daughters. Wives corrected their sisters-in-law. Even widows had a way of scanning a young woman's bodice with that look that said, "I see you, and so does the Lord." To survive, women had to internalize the system. They learned the dance, how to walk without swaying, speak without emotion, smile without implying availability. They learned that modesty wasn't just a value. It was a shield. And if they let that shield slip, even for a second, there'd be someone nearby to remind them. Someone might whisper it at the well. Or mention it in passing on the way to Mass. Or worse, not say anything at all, and simply pull their daughters closer when she passed by. Because shame was rarely loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in looks and gestures and sudden silences. Even when women were attacked, their modesty was scrutinized before their wounds were treated. Had she cried out? Had she fought back? Had she been asking for it? Sound familiar? Because 600 years later, we've still got courtrooms asking why a woman didn't scream. We've just traded the wool coif for workplace dress codes. And the town gossip for anonymous comments online. So the burden of male desire, and male violence, fell again on the women. Dress better. Speak less, hide more. Because modesty, they were told, was protection. But in practice, it was more like a trap. A trap you had to decorate yourself, keep polished, and sleep inside every night, knowing it might still not be enough. There are moments in history when you hope, just for a flicker, that the local spiritual authorities might have said something sensible. Something like, God gave you a body. Try not to freeze to death in it. But no. That's not quite how it went. This was the 13th to 15th century, a time when theology was flourishing, monasteries were copying books faster than ever, and new religious orders were preaching to the masses in growing towns and cities. It was also a time when the female body became a theological liability. The church had long drawn from the writings of early thinkers like Augustine, who very helpfully described women as morally weaker and more prone to temptation. And not just to being tempted, but to doing the tempting. Eve, of course, was still carrying the full PR fallout from the apple incident. But things got worse when medieval theologians began to mix classical philosophy, Christian doctrine, and an absolutely disastrous understanding of biology. For example, they believed that women were essentially inverted men. Literally. That a woman's reproductive organs were internal only because her body lacked sufficient heat and strength to push them out. From that premise, it was just a short walk to the conclusion that women were colder, wetter, and more naturally corrupt. And since desire was considered dangerous, the logic followed that women, the supposed origin of temptation, must be the gatekeepers of chastity. So what did that look like in real life? It meant that a woman who was assaulted might be asked, not about the man, but about her sins. It meant that monks wrote detailed lists of female temptations, how women's voices, hair, hands, and footsteps might lead men astray. And it meant that even female saints, the supposed role models, were often praised for how thoroughly they rejected their bodies. There were saints who starved themselves. Saints who shaved their heads to avoid admiration. Saints who disfigured their faces to escape marriage. And all of it was held up as beautiful, holy, worthy of imitation. So if a young woman grew up believing that beauty was both her power and her punishment, well, that wasn't an accident. That was doctrine. With footnotes. Confession, too, became a ritual of self-surveillance. Women were encouraged to confess the sin of vanity, not just for wearing color or lace, but for enjoying them. For caring about how they looked. For wanting to feel anything other than ashamed of their skin. It's like if your Sunday sermon ended with, "And remember, sisters, joy is suspicious, and Satan is of the devil." There were entire treatises written on how women should behave, many authored by men who had taken vows of celibacy, lived in cloisters, and probably hadn't spoken to a woman outside confession in a decade. And these writings made their way into pulpits and confessionals and family dinners, reinforcing the idea that a good woman must be humble, hidden, and preferably invisible. If a woman was attractive, it was a danger, her beauty a weapon, even if she never drew it. If she was unattractive, it was a fault, a kind of moral failing that surely reflected her inner decay. If she spoke too softly, she might be cunning, weaving temptation in whispers. If she spoke too loudly, she lacked modesty and therefore deserved the stares. Medieval preachers were oddly consistent in their inconsistency. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas insisted that women were naturally subordinate, prone to carnal weakness, and should therefore guard their bodies with shame. Penitentials, the Church's early guidebooks for confessors, listed penances for women who adorned themselves too brightly, wore pointed shoes, or even let their hair show on feast days. Bishops warned of perfumes, dyed fabrics, and laughter as signs of spiritual corruption. And so, women didn't just learn to fear desire. They learned to fear being desired. Because to be looked at was to be blamed. To be blamed was to be held responsible for someone else's gaze, someone else's thoughts, someone else's violence. It meant carrying a guilt you could never quite wash off, even if you bathed in holy water. Even if you did everything right. Even if your life looked like a prayer. Because the Church had made one thing painfully clear: your body wasn't yours. It was a test. And most women failed it, just by existing. In this part of the story, we'll take a quiet walk through the legal texts, moral treatises, and whispered rules that shaped how women were expected to behave, and how little it mattered if they obeyed. We'll look at who made these rules, how they were enforced, and the impossible contradictions women had to live with. And, of course, we'll pause for a few dry remarks about how this all compares to modern office dress codes. It's the 13th century in England. Or France. Or maybe the Holy Roman Empire. Honestly, you could throw a dart at the map and land on a place where the rules for women were written by men who didn't trust themselves. Canon law, royal law, town ordinances, guild charters, and local custom all tangled together in a big, bureaucratic shrug. But somehow still managed to agree on one thing. If a woman was assaulted, it was probably her fault. That is, unless she was over 60 or sufficiently disfigured. Then, the law might extend a thin veil of pity. For everyone else, there were questions. What was she wearing? Was she alone? Did she cry out? Did she cry out loud enough? Was there a witness? And did the witness think she looked like the sort of girl who would say yes? The law books rarely bothered with women's testimony, but they were quite interested in whether she braided her hair suggestively, or walked in the market without a chaperone, or wore shoes that clicked when she walked. Yes, really, in some towns, shoes were moral indicators. Nothing says spiritual danger like a woman with good posture and decent arch support. And if you're thinking this all sounds familiar, the idea that rules are written to protect, but enforced to control, you're not wrong. Much like today's HR manuals that somehow never apply to the CEO, the medieval codes of conduct were full of lofty ideals and very selective enforcement. A poor woman accused of immodesty might find herself paraded through the streets in nothing but a shift, a sign of shame around her neck. Meanwhile, a well-connected noblewoman could flirt in full view of the court, as long as her father's lands were politically useful. It's not that women didn't understand the rules. It's that the rules changed whenever they got too close to following them. Worse still, women themselves were drafted into the system, older women, widows, and midwives expected to monitor the behavior of younger girls, reinforcing the very shame they'd once endured. Female modesty became a communal burden. One girl's bare ankle might bring shame on an entire household. One woman's laughter in a tavern could mark her sisters as loose. And since the moral economy was based on reputation, not truth, it didn't really matter what a woman had done, only what could be said about her. Of course, none of this stopped men from making advances, or gossiping, or testing boundaries. But if something happened, the question was always, what did she do to invite it? There were exceptions, small, flickering moments of reason in an otherwise dim landscape. A few towns required compensation for injured women, and a few clerics wrote about consent. But these were the margins. The center held firm. A woman's safety depended not on men behaving, but on her being careful. And if you've ever had to walk to your car with your keys between your fingers, or fix your blouse in a bathroom mirror after someone at work made a comment, then you already understand the logic. Because the rules were never really about right or wrong. They were about control. And women were expected to be both the object of desire, and the guardian against it. At the same time, they said cleanliness was next to godliness, but for a medieval woman, it could also be a red flag. Imagine the bathhouse on market day, hot, damp, and smelling like boiled herbs and sins. The wooden tubs creaked with use, steam clouded every corner, and someone's child was always crying in the corner. You kept your eyes down. You scrubbed quickly. You didn't smile. Because even the simple act of getting clean came with an invisible ledger of suspicion. Too fragrant, and you might be vain. Too thorough, and someone might ask who you were hoping to impress. And worst of all, someone might tell the priest. Picture this, it's a market day, late in the afternoon, and the public bathhouse in your town has just opened. It's warm inside, too warm, really, a thick steam rising from the wooden tubs, carrying the sharp scent of lye soap, sweat, and half a dozen secrets no one dares speak aloud. You keep your eyes down. You wash quickly. And you wonder whether the priest saw you walking in. Because bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was about morality. And like nearly everything else in a woman's life, it was a delicate balance. If you were too clean, too perfumed, too visibly comfortable in your body, that was suspicious. But if you were too unkempt, that was a different kind of danger. Holiness, apparently, required a very specific pH level. So women walked a razor-thin line between indulgence and decay. And if they slipped, if they enjoyed their reflection too long in the basin, or walked home from the baths looking flushed, the whispers would start. A merchant's wife might be called vain. A servant girl might be branded promiscuous. A widow might be assumed to be available. And in the world of medieval sin, assumptions were as good as proof. That's where the confessors came in. A woman's private thoughts, her feelings, her dreams, even the involuntary ones, were now part of a public morality play, performed behind the latticework of a confessional screen. Did she entertain impure thoughts? Did she secretly long for affection? Had she noticed a man's hands at the well? These weren't just idle questions. They were moral landmines. And a woman's answer could shape her reputation, her penance, even her access to community rights like communion or marriage. Now, if you're wondering whether men were subject to the same moral interrogation, they weren't. Oh, the church technically had plenty to say about male lust, of course. But the enforcement was wildly uneven. A knight might boast of his conquests in a tavern and be admired. A woman who laughed too loudly at the joke might be warned about her tempting spirit. It didn't help that the line between sin and crime was often blurred. Lust was a sin. Fornication was a sin. Adultery, in some cases, was both sin and legal offense. But only if it was the woman's fault, which, conveniently, it almost always was. So a woman's body became a kind of moral terrain, not sacred, not inviolable, but suspicious. And she was expected to patrol it like a soldier in enemy territory. Watch what you wear. Watch how you walk. Don't bathe too often, don't smell too nice, don't speak too sweetly, unless, of course, you were married, and then you were supposed to be attractive, but only to one man, and never too visibly. Basically, don't exist, unless it's in service of someone else's narrative. And if you think about it, if you've ever sat through a talk about modesty that somehow managed to be entirely about men's self-control, then you've already walked those same mental corridors. The phrases have changed, the setting has changed, but the logic is terribly familiar. Because medieval women weren't just told what to feel. They were told how their feelings, or someone else's feelings about them, could damn their souls. So they confessed. They apologized. They lowered their eyes. And they prayed, not always for forgiveness. Sometimes, just for silence. Once a woman's name became interesting, it was already too late. Gossip, after all, didn't need evidence. It needed only the suggestion of a story, a lowered voice, a meaningful glance, a neighbor who thought you smiled too widely at the baker's son on the way to morning mass. In most medieval towns, women didn't need to confess anything out loud. Their sins could be written for them, rehearsed in kitchens and under breath, passed like sour bread between midwives and milkmaids until everyone was full of it. There were no printed tabloids, of course. No parchment columns with grainy sketches of local sinners. But the news had legs. And a woman's reputation could travel farther than her own body was ever allowed to go. One wrong look, one poorly timed laugh, one moment of being noticed, and she might find herself whispered about by people who had never even seen her. She might never hear the words herself. But she would feel them, in the sudden silence when she entered a room, in the mothers who pulled their sons away too quickly, in the priest who began to speak of Eve more often than usual from the pulpit. It didn't matter if she had done anything. In fact, in many cases, it was safer to have done something scandalous, at least then she'd know what they were accusing her of. The real danger came when there was nothing at all. Because silence invited speculation, and speculation was fertile soil for sin. A woman with no visible faults was probably hiding something. A girl who blushed too easily must have a secret. A widow who didn't cry loud enough must have helped the illness along. This wasn't just neighborly chatter. Gossip was a form of governance. It disciplined the unwed, regulated the married, and kept widows from getting too comfortable. In places where formal punishment was rare, social punishment did the job just fine. You didn't need to be fined or flogged when everyone in the village could simply decide not to sit next to you at the feast. When the baker stopped giving you credit. When the midwife suddenly had no time for your labor pains. And some of the most damaging gossip, of course, came cloaked in religious concern. A priest might suggest more fasting. A neighbor might recommend a pilgrimage, not too far, just far enough to miss the wedding she hadn't been invited to anyway. A mother might lower her voice and tell her daughter not to play with that girl, the one who walks with her head too high and whose father used to drink too much. Sins, once imagined, rarely disappeared. They clung like wood smoke. They lingered long after the fire went out. And still, there were the rare and exhausting efforts to fight it. A woman might try to correct the rumors. She might speak up, demand to be heard, insist that she had done nothing wrong. But in doing so, she often confirmed what they already suspected, that she was too bold, too proud, too eager to defend herself. Because in this world, modesty was not just a virtue. It was an alibi. And silence, maddening, complicit silence, was the only thing that couldn't be quoted against you. It's not all that unfamiliar. Even now, if a woman posts the wrong photo, wears the wrong outfit, or says the wrong thing at the wrong time, there's always someone ready to write the rest of her story for her. The medium has changed, but the method hasn't. Just like then, the loudest accusations often come from people who've never met her. And the sentence is the same as it ever was: isolation, judgment, and a reputation you didn't ask for. At least today, no one sends you to a convent for it. There were many ways to sin in medieval Europe. But one of the quietest, and perhaps most absurd, was simply forgetting to pluck your forehead. You see, in the late Middle Ages, beauty became its own battlefield. Women were expected to pursue it, display it, and suffer for it, but never too eagerly. It had to look effortless, divine, untainted by vanity. And so, they plucked their hairlines to make their foreheads appear longer, a practice that sounds ridiculous until you remember the 2010s existed, and women willingly glued plastic caterpillars to their eyelashes. But back in the 14th and 15th centuries, the ideal woman was pale, high-browed, and ethereal, the sort of creature who looked as though she hadn't eaten in days, which, to be fair, she often hadn't, and whose beauty suggested a spiritual purity so delicate it might shatter under sunlight. Which is probably why she was expected to stay indoors, avoid tanning, and glow faintly like a votive candle. Of course, none of this was actually about beauty. It was about control. Because if a woman failed to meet these standards, she was accused of neglecting her duty to appear desirable, to her husband, to God, to the male artists painting saints who all mysteriously resembled the same 5 blonde models. But if she succeeded too well, if she plucked her forehead too enthusiastically or lined her lips a little too red, she risked being called vain, seductive, manipulative, a walking temptation. There was no correct setting. She was always either too much or not enough. And the church noticed. By the 13th century, preachers were already railing against women's clothing and hairstyles in public sermons. One Dominican friar in particular, a man named Giordano di Pisa, warned that women who braided their hair or dyed it with saffron would be burned for eternity by the very locks they so proudly displayed. That's right, your curls might be flammable in hell. And yet, women went on adjusting, modifying, adapting, not because they were vain, but because they were scared. They knew what it meant to be seen the wrong way. They knew how quickly beauty could become blame. It wasn't about expressing themselves. It was about surviving the social economy of visibility, where being plain was dangerous, and being lovely was criminal. There's something tragically familiar about that. We still live in a world where women are expected to be flawless, but natural. Thin, but not insecure. Attractive, but not asking for it. The rules are different now, but the contradiction hasn't changed. It's just moved from pulpit to pixel. From church edict to Instagram comment section. And still, the punishment comes quietly, in opportunities withheld, judgments whispered, or the aching sense that your body has somehow failed an exam you didn't agree to take. Back then, a woman could be publicly punished for her clothing. Literally dragged into court if her sleeves were too long, her neckline too low, or her belt made her waist look too tempting. In 1350s Florence, sumptuary laws banned women from wearing certain fabrics unless their husbands earned a specific amount, because even beauty, apparently, had to be budgeted. And it worked. Not because women were convinced, but because they were exhausted. They knew they were being watched, judged, read like scripture, punished like heretics, and expected to say thank you for the attention. And so they kept plucking, adjusting, dimming their glow, just enough to pass. Because in a world built to blame women for being seen, invisibility started to feel like a safer kind of freedom. Even if it meant losing yourself to keep your soul. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in glances, in whispers, in rules you didn't write but had to follow to survive. It happened every time a woman lowered her eyes, not because she was modest, but because she was afraid. Every time she adjusted her veil, not for warmth, but to disappear. Every time she wrapped herself tighter, shrank smaller, took up less space, hoping, somehow, to be less visible, less noticed, less punished for the shape of her body. Because in the medieval world, to be looked at wasn't a compliment. It was a liability. It meant your soul might be at risk, not because you'd done anything, but because someone else had imagined something. And their thoughts were your responsibility. Their desire was your fault. Their sin had your face on it. So women learned to carry that. And they carried it in their postures, in their speech, in their silences. They carried it into marriage, into church, into childbirth, into every room where their presence was tolerated, but never fully theirs. They walked through life as both the danger and the accused, the tempter and the condemned. And if they asked why, the answer came wrapped in scripture and shame. It wasn't about who they were. It was about how they were seen. And in that way, medieval sin was deeply modern. Because even now, the gaze still defines the rules. Who is desirable? Who is dangerous? Who is allowed to want, and who must never be wanted, unless she wants the consequences too? Medieval women didn't just fear lust. They feared what it would cost them. A look could lead to gossip. Gossip to judgment. Judgment to punishment. Legal, social, spiritual. A husband might cast you out. A priest might humiliate you. A town might mark you forever with a story you couldn't undo. And the beauty of it, the cruel, absurd, almost satirical beauty, was that none of this required action. You didn't have to speak, flirt, smile, or even stand too close. You just had to exist. And someone else had to notice. That was enough. So yes, in the Middle Ages, lust was a sin. But being seen was a risk. And being desirable? That was the most dangerous thing a woman could be. It meant you had power, but not the kind you could use. Only the kind you'd be punished for. And somewhere, in the back of your mind, even now, you still feel it. When you adjust your shirt before walking past a group of men. When you second-guess a photo before posting it. When you think, even for a second, was it my fault? That echo isn't yours. It has been inherited. From centuries of women who were blamed for being beautiful. For being visible. For being alive in a world that insisted their bodies were invitations, and their silence was the only way to stay safe. They weren't sinners. They were survivors. And they still are. Desire was not invented by men. But you wouldn't know that from the history books. Because when medieval women felt longing, real, physical, aching longing, it didn't have a name they were allowed to use. There were no saints for that. No feast days. No prayers for when your skin burned and you had nowhere to put the fire. Because you weren't supposed to burn at all. You were supposed to be pure. Not just in action, but in thought, in body, in dream. And yet, they did dream. Of touch. Of closeness. Of being chosen not just for breeding, or dowry, or status, but for something that couldn't be named in church without lowering your voice and checking the door. The truth is, yes. Women felt desire. Yes, even the ones in veils. Even the ones who prayed every morning. Even the ones who married young and never left the house without a chaperone. Because hormones didn't ask for papal permission. And loneliness doesn't care if you're betrothed. Some women turned their longing into poetry, the kind that had to be hidden in prayer books or disguised as devotion. Some wrote songs about saints with burning hearts and divine touches, using spiritual ecstasy as a legal loophole. Because if you said your longing was for God, no one asked about the tears on your pillow. Others waited. Waited for a husband who might be kind. For a moment of privacy. for a hand that didn't bruise. Or they learned how to bury it, deep enough that even they forgot it was there. Until it woke them one night and reminded them what their body could feel, even if it never would. And then, of course, there were women who acted on it. Quietly, carefully, sometimes dangerously. A maid who lingered too long in the barn with a stable boy. A noblewoman who smiled too softly at the wrong night. A widow who let herself be touched again because no one was watching, until someone was. These women were judged, named, punished. Not because they wanted more than others, but because they dared to have it known. The rules weren't just about behavior. They were about erasure. You were allowed to exist, as long as you didn't need anything. As long as you didn't crave anything. As long as you didn't remind anyone that you, too, were made of flesh. That your body wasn't just a vessel. It was you. And it wanted to. The church had no roadmap for that. So women made their own. Some carved out moments of freedom in friendship. Some in stories. Some, just in memory, a glance that meant something, a touch that no one could take back. Others found it only in silence. A secret kept for a lifetime. A breath held between what was expected and what was felt. And centuries later, that breath is still held. Because even now, in a world with fewer rules, the old guilt lingers. Not because you sinned, but because you noticed your body was still yours. And you wondered whether that made you dangerous. It didn't. It made you honest. Good night. And thank you for walking through this story with me. Tonight, we sat quietly with a truth that's older than we'd like to admit. That for much of history, a woman's body was not her own. Not in the law. Not in the church. Not in the whispered expectations handed down from mother to daughter, like a dress you didn't choose, but still had to wear. We traced how beauty, something so often admired, became a reason for blame. How desire turned from feeling into threat. And how to be seen could become a punishment. But we also saw something else. That even in silence, women found ways to remain whole. In small rebellions. In secret poems. In glances never confessed aloud. Because even when the world tried to take away their agency, their voices, their pleasure, something in them stayed soft. Stayed wanting. Stayed alive. And that quiet, stubborn life. It still matters. Maybe it's the part of you that always knew you weren't wrong for wanting more. Or the part of you that sometimes wonders why being seen still feels like a risk. Maybe it's the quiet ache of being too much, or not enough, or just trying to be safe in a world that never really was. But here, at this moment, you are safe. There are no eyes on you. No judgments. Just the soft hum of history folding in on itself, like a blanket around your shoulders. You don't have to explain your worth tonight. You never did. So if your body is tired, let it rest. If your mind is racing, let it slow. And if your heart is holding something heavy, just know. You are not alone in carrying it. Not then. Not now. Not ever. Good night. And sleep well. Script written by Clara Finch. Because some stories still deserve a soul.